PhD, Sarah has worked for nearly 15 years as a community-based researcher, writer, and educator focused on building the capacity of Indigenous communities to address issues related to violence. Sarah's doctoral research investigated issues of law and violence in colonial relations in BC, examining the inherent violence of Canadian law, as well as community-based anti-violence initiatives that draw on principles of Indigenous law. Sarah is of mixed Kwakwaka'wakw, Ukrainian and English ancestry. She is a published author as well as an occasional blogger for Media Indigena, Nations Rising, and the collaborative Becoming Collective blog. You can find out more about her work on her academia.edu page. Google Sarah Hunt. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm just going to stand, if you don't mind, so I can see the slides. I just want to start by thanking all the organizers of today's event, and we spent some time today coming together before tonight's event, and as you saw with the dance video earlier, there's just a long history and a lot of work happening in our communities all across Turtle Island to address violence in lots of different ways. So I just want to honor all the people who aren't here and those who have gone before us to lay the groundwork for this work. So thank you all for being here today. So my name is Sarah Hunt. As Audrey said, I'm Kwagyo from the Kwakwaka'wakw people from Sahis on the northern part of Vancouver Island. And I'm going to talk today a bit about how we think about justice in the context of this relentless and ongoing violence. So before I do, I just wanted to tell you a bit about my work. So I've been working mostly in BC for the last 15 years or so. I started doing work around violence in kind of the mid-90s, before the Picton case had come to light and before this issue was really talked about outside of our local communities. And really doing work, prevention work and kind of intervention work. Some of that work was within systems, with police, trying to change those systems, and then increasingly getting frustrated with trying to change those systems, and looking instead to some of the things that I'll talk about today. Most recently, in the last few years, when I was doing research for my PhD, I interviewed other people like myself who've been doing anti-violence work around BC. So some of the things that I'll talk about today are principles that came from the interviews that I did with them, and networking with other First Nations people doing work around violence. So I have a map here. These are all the language groups of BC. Often when we see maps of our territories, they're marked by the reserves that are given to us by the government that they decide we're allowed to have, and these are all of the language groups, so all the distinct First Nations. So I'm talking today about Indigenous law. I'm not talking about those bands, but I'm talking instead about these territorial relations that we've had for many, many years before colonialism began. So I'm Kwakwaka'wakw, which you see there on the left bottom, and I'll be talking about a case as well today. You see Sakani in the middle there, and I'll be talking about a case within the Sakani territories. So I'm just going to do that, okay? So today I'm going to, as I said, talk a bit about what justice looks like. So when we are looking for answers to violence, or when violence happens, when a murder happens, when someone goes missing, we seek justice. That's kind of what a lot of people are seeking, is justice. But as I'm going to talk about today, I want to kind of question, what do we mean by justice, and how can we think about justice differently? A lot of us are already thinking about it differently, but wanting to think about some principles of what justice might look like. Okay. Okay. So I guess I just want to start with the premise that I think we can all agree on, that to find justice, the murders must end, the violence must end. But for the murders to end, we have to start to matter before we go missing or show up dead. So often we're looking for justice after violence occurs, but obviously the point is to get to stopping the violence. And a lot of the solutions, that come after something happens are not enough. We have to start to change, I think, the terms on which we have relationships with each other within our own communities and with across community contexts. So how can we change the terms of that, of our engagement? As Indigenous people, as I talked about, we had our own ways, our own laws, coming from our own cultural context in our territories, and those haven't gone away. So I think that what I'm talking about today is looking more deeply at how we can draw on the principles from our own laws so that we can change the terms of our engagement with one another so that we can really stop the violence and so we start to matter before we go missing. So I think I just wanted to also talk about the context in which we're seeking justice. So that the issue of missing and murdered women that we talk about now is not a new issue. This is something that, as we have police reports or media reports, it's as though we're just realizing this for the first time. But this is not a new issue. That this is, in fact, inherent to colonial relations. So the deaths and disappearances, we might think about the children who were taken from our communities for residential school, the fact that there's been a lot of violence all throughout this history of colonialism here. So the violence, I think it's important to see it within a continuum of violence. So looking for solutions, as we're talking about here today, has to be situating the deaths and the disappearances within that continuum of sexual violence, of gender violence, of spiritual violence, all the kinds of violence that have been introduced in our communities. That if we just look at them separately, and often responses say that are government funded are separating them out, right? This kind of violence, you go to this program, this kind of violence, go to that program. Housing is different, doesn't relate to violence. Mental health is totally separate, that you have to access services in a different way. That violence is thought of as being a criminal act that's separate from all these other ways that we are being in the world. So in order to, these are kind of some of the ways I think that when we're seeking solutions to violence, this is kind of the broader context. And then sort of the fact that Canadian law is a punitive system. This is something, talking to people around BC who've been trying to do work around violence for a long time, trying to change the legal system, trying to change the attitudes, say, of police or social workers and people on the ground, really needing to recognize the limitations of that change, because the Canadian legal system is not intended for healing. It's not intended for building relationships. It is a punitive system that is intended to punish those who commit crimes. So that's the system that we're dealing with. So if we want to look at other things besides just punishment, then we need to start looking at maybe changing our definitions of justice. Because as we seek justice, if we're just looking for a legal conviction, for example, to me that's not enough, because it doesn't get at that prevention and changing the terms in which the violence happens. So I wanted to kind of ground this discussion in a real life example. So as I said, murder is kind of the extreme form of violence that happens, but there's lots of other kinds of violence that Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people and just Indigenous people in general continue to face all the time. I wanted to talk about a case where justice was served, supposedly, and to see what that justice looked like. So there's a case in Prince George where some of you might have heard of it, with Judge Ramsey. He was a provincial court judge. And this was a case that I started hearing reports that Judge Ramsey had some young women who were involved in kind of street life and street economies in Prince George had been severely attacked or abused by him. And he was still a sitting court judge. So these were kind of rumors that were happening when I was doing work in that community. And around 1999 was when police actually started doing investigations. But there weren't any young women who were willing to come forward and actually make a report because of the power that he held in a lot of their lives. Finally, a 16-year-old young woman formally reported to police because when she went for the custody hearing for her child, he was the judge who had beaten her and left her outside of town, left her for dead not long before. So she went running out of the court and finally made a report to the police. 3 other young women came forward, and he admitted, so he pled guilty in 2004 to incidents that happened between 1992 and 2001. And he, for that, received a 7-year sentence. He later died in prison of cancer. And so what did justice look like for those young women? So they came forward, they made the reports to police, the offender was convicted. So, you know, in that case, we might say that justice was served if that's what we're looking for. But what I heard through working with people in the communities, including with family members and people who worked very closely throughout that court case, was that when the young girls came forward, the justice system and all the funders in the province came together. They put the young women in a house, they got a support worker for them. But as soon as the case was done, as soon as the conviction came through and Judge Ramsey was sent to prison, was that the girls were just left on their own and for themselves. So there was nothing put into place other than giving them housing for the duration waiting for the court, and then that was it, they're on their own. So since that time, 2 of the young women died, one of a drug overdose. The young women essentially just went back to the lives that they had before. They didn't have anything beyond just getting support to the point of getting a conviction. The point for the province was to support them for the court case, to be witnesses in the court case, right? So that is the reality of what that looks like, what justice looked like for them. So if we think about the fact that that it took many years to get from the rumors happening to the report being made, and all that time the violence continued, and even now the reality for those young women is the same, right? Nothing was put in place to actually try to change the conditions in which that violence unfolds.